They told me, stay quiet. Nobody cares what you think. You'd expect that from strangers. But it wasn't strangers. It was my own blood. And those words, they cut deeper than any knife. My name is Lorraine Mitchell. I'm 72 years old, a widow, and for most of my life, I believed family was sacred. I thought loyalty could weather any storm. I was wrong. But before I tell you what happened, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Which city? Which country? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know who's listening to my story. This house is not just 4 walls and a roof. It was built by my husband, Richard, and me over 40 years ago. I still remember the day we walked through it for the first time. Empty floors, sunlight spilling across bare wood, the smell of paint still fresh. He held my hand so tight and said, "Lorraine, this is it. This is where our life begins." And it did. We raised our children here. I cooked countless meals in the same kitchen where my granddaughter later learned how to stir cookie dough. I planted roses in the garden, red ones for love and yellow for friendship. Richard spent months building a porch with his own hands, sanding and painting until it was perfect. Every corner of this home carries his touch, his spirit. After he passed, the house became even more sacred to me. It wasn't just shelter, it was memory. It was the last piece of him I had left. So when my son, David, and his wife Melissa began circling like vultures, hinting, suggesting, then outright demanding that the house should belong to them, it wasn't just property they were after. It was my life's anchor. It was the one place that still made me feel whole. The first hints were almost casual. Melissa would smile sweetly at Sunday dinners and say things like, "This house is so big for just you, Mom. Don't you think David and I could put it to better use? The kids need more space, after all." At first, I laughed it off. I thought they were joking. I said, "I'm not going anywhere. This house is mine and your father's, and it will be until the day I leave this earth." But then David, my own son, the boy I carried, nursed, and raised, began to echo her. His voice wasn't light or teasing. It was firm, sharp, and laced with impatience. "Mum, you don't understand. You can't manage a house like this anymore. It's not safe for you. Let us take it over. We'll handle everything." Handle everything. That phrase still makes me sick, because what he really meant was, hand it over, so we can erase you. I knew then that this wasn't going to end with a polite disagreement. The pressure grew. Every phone call, every visit, turned into a negotiation I never asked for. Melissa would place real estate brochures on the table as though I couldn't see them. David stopped asking me about my health, my day, my life. He only asked about the house. The cruelest part? The way they dismissed me. Every time I tried to speak, Melissa's eyes rolled. Every time I protested, David sighed like I was a burden. Then came the night that broke me. We were sitting at dinner when Melissa smirked across the table and said to David, loud enough for me to hear, "Honestly, nobody cares what she thinks. She should just stay quiet and let us handle it." And David, my son, laughed. He laughed. That's when I realized I wasn't just fighting to keep a roof over my head. I was fighting to keep my dignity. And if they thought I would roll over quietly, they had forgotten who they were dealing with. This is where it begins. The story of how they tried to strip me of everything, and how in the end, they walked out of that courtroom, pale, ashamed, and empty-handed, while I walked out with my head held high. You'd think the people you raised, the ones you fed, clothed, and sat beside through every scraped knee and every broken heart, would have a little more respect. But respect is the first thing to vanish when greed walks in the door. It started small. A comment here, a suggestion there. The kind of things you might brush off if you weren't paying attention. One afternoon, Melissa came over uninvited. She wandered through the living room with her phone, snapping pictures of the furniture, the walls, even the family portraits. I asked her what she was doing. She gave me that polished smile of hers and said, "Just showing a friend of mine. She's an interior designer. Can you imagine how stunning this place would look with a few changes?" Changes. As if my home, where Richard's handprints were still on the banister he polished himself, was just a canvas for her vanity projects. I felt a sour twist in my stomach. Then came the family gatherings. I'd speak up, try to join the conversation, but Melissa's voice always sliced through mine. "Oh, Lorraine, don't worry about that. You wouldn't understand the paperwork." Or, "Just let us handle it. You're retired now, remember?" And David, my David, he didn't defend me. He didn't even glance my way. He sat there, sipping his drink, nodding along like Melissa was Moses, come down with commandments carved in stone. The isolation crept in slowly. They stopped inviting me to outings with the grandchildren. When I asked about it, Melissa waved her manicured hand and said, "We didn't think you'd want to come. Too much walking, you know, and we don't want you to strain yourself." I strained myself raising that boy. I strained myself working 2 jobs while Richard built his business from scratch. I strained myself burying my husband alone. But somehow, in Melissa's eyes, I was just a fragile old woman in the way. One evening, I overheard them in the kitchen. I was pouring myself tea when their voices floated in from the next room. "Melissa. She's stubborn, David. We need to push harder. The sooner the deed is in your name, the sooner we can make real plans." David. "I know, but she's not budging. Maybe we should just get the lawyer involved now." Melissa. "Good. Do it. She doesn't need to know every detail. Just tell her it's safer this way. She'll believe you. She always believes you." My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the teacup. "She'll believe you. As though I were a fool. As though my love for my son had made me blind." That night, I sat at the kitchen table, long after they'd left. The clock ticked past midnight, and still I sat there, staring at the contract they'd accidentally left behind. A draft of some transfer papers. My name was printed neatly at the top, waiting for a signature. Their names were listed beneath, waiting to take what wasn't theirs. I realized then, this wasn't about helping me manage. This was theft, dressed up in polite conversation and fake smiles, but theft all the same. The next morning I called David. I wanted to give him one last chance, one moment to prove I was wrong about what I'd heard. "David," I said, my voice trembling, "are you really trying to take the house?" There was a pause on the line. Then he sighed. "Mum, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You don't need the stress of owning a home. Just sign it over, and we'll take care of everything." Take care of everything. The words slammed into me again. That's when I knew. He wasn't protecting me. He wasn't thinking of my well-being. He was protecting himself, protecting Melissa, protecting their ambition. I hung up without another word. My throat was tight, my chest burning, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I made myself a promise that day. They would not take what Richard and I had built. They would not strip me of my dignity. And if they thought I was too weak to fight back, then they had forgotten who raised David in the first place. This wasn't going to be a battle of words over dinner. This was going to be war. And in war, I had one advantage they didn't know about. I still had the original deed, tucked away safely, signed decades ago. My name was on it, mine alone. The storm finally broke on a Sunday evening. I had just finished setting the table, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, the way David used to love them as a boy. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, we could sit down as a family and share a meal without the shadow of that cursed house looming over us. But Melissa never let peace linger. She walked in wearing that smug smile, heels clicking across my hardwood floor like a countdown to disaster. David followed, his shoulders tight, his jaw set. The children bolted to the living room, sensing the tension adults try so hard to hide. We sat down, plates filled. For 10 long minutes we ate in brittle silence. I could feel it coming, the way the air thickened, the way David kept glancing at Melissa, waiting for her cue. And then she gave it. "Lorraine," Melissa began, her voice syrupy but sharp underneath. "We've been more than patient. It's time you stop dragging this out. David and I have made a decision. You're going to sign the house over. This week." I set my fork down, my hand steady though my chest thundered. "This house isn't yours to take, Melissa." Her smile didn't waver. "We're not taking it. We're securing it. You can't keep living here alone. What if you fall? What if something happens? You'll be safer with us handling things." I looked at David then, hoping, begging, for him to contradict her, to look me in the eye and say he would never push me out of the home his father built. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low, authoritative, like a stranger wearing my son's face. "Mum, enough. Melissa's right. You've been stubborn long enough. Either sign the house to me or get out." The words fell like stones. My heart clenched so tightly I thought it might stop. I searched his eyes for even a flicker of guilt, but all I found was determination. "Get out?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is my home." David slammed his hand against the table, rattling the dishes. "It's too much for you, Mum. Don't you get it? Nobody wants to watch you struggle here alone. You're making it harder for all of us." Melissa leaned back, smirking, and delivered the dagger. "Stay quiet, Lorraine. Nobody cares what you think. Just sign the papers." For a moment, the room spun. My own son sat beside this woman, nodding at her words, as though my voice, my very existence, was nothing. I pushed back my chair slowly. The scrape of wood on tile echoed louder than David's outburst. I stood, hands trembling. But my voice, when it finally came, was steel. "I fed you when I had nothing but scraps. I worked nights so you could have shoes on your feet. I buried your father alone, and I kept this house standing while you built your life. And now you sit here and tell me I don't matter." David wouldn't meet my eyes. Melissa did, and her smirk widened. "That's right. You don't. Not when it comes to this house." I walked into the kitchen then, not trusting myself to stay at that table. My body shook with fury, with grief, with something darker, resolve. They thought they had cornered me. They thought my silence was weakness. But silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. That night, long after they'd left, I stood in front of Richard's portrait in the hallway. His smile in that photograph, the same one he wore when he first held the deed to this house, gave me strength. "I won't let them take it, Richard," I whispered. "I promise you. They'll learn whose name really matters." And from that night forward, I wasn't just their mother. I became their opponent. They thought my silence that night was defeat. What they didn't realize was that silence can be the sharpest weapon. The morning after that humiliating dinner, I opened the cedar box Richard and I had kept locked in the bedroom closet for decades. Inside were papers that smelled faintly of dust and time. Insurance forms, old letters, and tucked in a crisp envelope, the original deed to our house. My hand lingered on Richard's signature, bold and steady, beside mine. No one else's name touched that paper. Not David's, not Melissa's, just ours. I ran my fingers across it like a sacred relic. In that moment, I knew. This was my shield, my proof, my salvation. But I also knew better than to wave it in their faces too soon. Greed has a way of digging its own grave, and I wanted David and Melissa to dig theirs deep enough that when the truth came crashing down, they wouldn't be able to climb out. So I made an appointment with Mr. Thompson, the lawyer who had once been Richard's closest business partner. He was older now, greyer, but when I walked into his office with that envelope, his eyes softened. Lorraine, he said, adjusting his glasses. Haven't seen you in years. What brings you in? I laid the deed gently on his desk. Trouble, I said, and the kind only family can cause. He studied the paper, then looked at me with a kind of grim respect. This deed is airtight. You're the sole owner. What are they trying to do? So I told him about Melissa's manipulation, David's ultimatum, the humiliation at the dinner table. By the end, his jaw was set. They can scream, they can threaten, they can even try to forge papers. But unless you put your signature on something new, this house is yours. No court in this state will say otherwise. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Relief, yes, but also a spark of something hotter. Defiance. Let them come, I said. Let them push harder. I'll be ready. Mr. Thompson nodded. Keep everything they send you, every text, every paper they slide across your table. It'll only help your case when the time comes. I left his office lighter, though my heart still ached. Because here's the truth. I didn't want to fight my son. I didn't want a courtroom or a scandal. I wanted my family back. But sometimes you have to choose between being loved and being respected. And I was done letting them trample me. Back at home, the pressure mounted. Melissa showed up one afternoon with a clipboard and a smile too wide to be real. These are just some preliminary forms, she said, waving the papers. Nothing serious. Just sign at the bottom so we can start transferring utilities. I took the clipboard, skimmed the fine print, and saw the words, transfer of property rights. My stomach knotted, but I smiled back sweetly. I'll look it over later, I told her, handing it back. Her smile faltered. No need, Lorraine. It's just a formality, trust me. Melissa, I said quietly, I'm too old to trust anyone without reading every word. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction. She knew she hadn't won. Not yet. The calls from David came next. Mum, Melissa said you're being difficult. Why can't you just sign? It'll make everything easier. Easier for who? I asked. For everyone, he snapped. Then softer. For me. That was the moment it sank in. He wasn't just Melissa's puppet. He wanted this too. My son. My flesh and blood. It broke something inside me, but it also steeled me. Because if he was willing to betray me for a house, then I had nothing left to lose by fighting back. So I gathered everything. I printed texts. I saved voicemails. I kept copies of every so-called form they pushed my way. Each one went into a neat folder I tucked beside the deed in Richard's cedar box. They thought I was old, fragile, easy to manipulate. What they didn't know was that I had just turned their every move into evidence. And while they plotted to corner me, I was quietly building the case that would destroy them. The letter came in a crisp white envelope. Summons to appear. My own son had dragged me into court. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in my hands. For a moment I felt a stab of sorrow so deep it stole my breath. Courtrooms were for criminals, not for mothers and sons, not for families. But apparently that's exactly where we belonged now. The day of the hearing, I dressed carefully. Navy skirt, cream blouse, the pearl necklace Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look steady, composed, not a frail woman they could shove aside. I walked into that courthouse with my back straight, my folder of documents clutched tightly under my arm. The room buzzed with low conversation, the sound of heels on tile, the shuffle of papers. David and Melissa were already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table. Melissa's lips curled in a triumphant smile when she saw me. David didn't look at me at all. I took my seat quietly. My lawyer, Mr. Thompson, leaned in. Remember, Lorraine, you don't have to do much. Just tell the truth. The papers will speak louder than they ever could. The judge entered, stern and efficient. The gavel struck wood, and the case began. Melissa's lawyer stood first, striding with the arrogance of a man certain he'd already won. Your Honor, he began, this case is straightforward. My clients, David and Melissa Mitchell, have been supporting Mrs. Mitchell for years. She is no longer capable of maintaining the home she occupies. For her safety, for her family's stability, the property should be transferred into their care. We have prepared the necessary documentation. He handed a stack of papers to the clerk with a flourish, like a magician revealing his final trick. Melissa smirked at me across the room. David shifted in his chair, his leg bouncing nervously. The judge nodded. Very well. And what does the defense have to say? Mr. Thompson rose, calm as ever. Your Honor, this case is indeed straightforward, but not for the reasons presented. The question before us is simple. Who owns the house? The judge's eyes flicked to me. Mrs. Mitchell, do you have documentation of ownership? That was the moment. The one they never saw coming. I stood slowly, every eye in the courtroom on me. My heart pounded, but my voice, when it came, was clear, strong, steady. Yes, Your Honor. I opened my folder and pulled out the envelope I had guarded like treasure. My fingers didn't shake as I laid the original deed on the clerk's table. The very deed Richard and I had signed all those years ago. The clerk's eyes scanned the paper, then widened slightly. He handed it to the judge, who studied it for a long moment before speaking. This deed clearly lists Lorraine Mitchell as the sole owner of the property. No transfers, no co-signers, no amendments. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Melissa's smirk vanished. David's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a man grasping for air. The judge's gaze sharpened. Mrs. Mitchell, do you dispute the claim that you cannot manage the property alone? I lifted my chin. With respect, Your Honor, I have lived in that house for over 40 years. I've managed it through storms, repairs, and loss. I buried my husband there. I raised my children there. I have managed just fine, and I will continue to. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to David and Melissa. Do you have any evidence that contradicts this deed? Melissa sputtered. Well, she said she would. David finally spoke, his voice cracking. She promised us. She said she'd sign it over. The judge's voice boomed. Verbal promises do not override legal ownership, Mr. Mitchell. Unless you can provide documentation signed by your mother, this case has no merit. Silence. Dead. Heavy silence. I looked at them then. My son and the woman he'd chosen over his own mother. They had tried to strip me of my home, my dignity. And now, in front of strangers, the law had spoken louder than either of them ever could. Melissa slumped back in her chair, pale and furious. David covered his face with his hands. And I simply sat down, my pearls cool against my skin, my head held high. But what none of them knew was that this wasn't over. Not yet. Because tucked in that folder, alongside the deed, I had something else. Something that would turn humiliation into exposure. The judge was already preparing to dismiss the case when Mr. Thompson rose again. Your Honor, he said smoothly, before we conclude, there's one more matter that should be brought to the court's attention. Melissa's head snapped up. David stiffened. I could almost hear their thoughts screaming. What else could he possibly have? Mr. Thompson held up another folder. Thicker, heavier than the one with my deed. He handed it to the clerk, who brought it to the bench. These, Mr. Thompson said, his voice steady, are documents my client received from her son and daughter-in-law in recent weeks. Drafts of property transfer forms, allegedly presented as preliminary or routine. However, when we examined them closely, we found inconsistencies. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through the stack. His brow furrowed. Inconsistencies? He asked. Mr. Thompson nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Specifically signatures that appear forged, legal language altered to favor the plaintiffs, and dates that predate any supposed consent from my client. In short, fraud. The word cracked through the courtroom like thunder. Melissa leapt to her feet. That's a lie. We never— Sit down, the judge barked. David's face was white as parchment, sweat beading at his temple. He leaned toward Melissa, whispering urgently, but she shoved his hand away, eyes blazing. The judge turned another page, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then he looked up, his gaze heavy. Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Mitchell, did you knowingly attempt to file fraudulent paperwork to obtain this property? David stammered. I didn't know, I thought— Melissa cut in, her voice shrill. We were just trying to make sure the house was protected. She said she couldn't keep up anymore. My hands curled into fists in my lap. They lied so easily. They always had an excuse ready, always a way to twist the knife and then say it was for my own good. Mr. Thompson wasn't done. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit C. That page shows a signature that was allegedly Mrs. Mitchell's. But as you can see, the handwriting analysis indicates it was traced from an older document. In other words, copied. A forgery. The judge studied it for a long moment, then slammed the folder shut. His voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. This court does not tolerate fraud, not from strangers, and certainly not from family members attempting to exploit their own mother. Consider yourselves fortunate I am not referring this immediately for criminal prosecution. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Melissa's face twisted, caught between fury and panic. David sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles went white. For the first time I felt no sorrow, no pity, only clarity. I rose, my voice steady. Your Honor, all I wanted was peace. I wanted my son to respect what his father and I built. Instead, he tried to steal it. And she— I pointed at Melissa, who flinched, encouraged him to do it. Melissa spat. You selfish old witch. Enough, the judge roared. The gavel struck hard against the block. Another outburst like that, and I will hold you in contempt. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Finally, the judge turned back to me. His tone softened. Mrs. Mitchell, the deed is yours. It always has been. The court recognizes your sole ownership, and this case is dismissed, with prejudice. That means they cannot file it again. With prejudice. Final. Irrevocable. I sat back down, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. Across the aisle, Melissa's face was twisted in fury, her mask shattered. David slumped in his chair, staring at the table as though he couldn't bear to meet my eyes. They had tried to erase me. Instead, they erased themselves. The judge's gavel struck once more. Case dismissed. Ownership remains with Mrs. Lorraine Mitchell. The words rang through the courtroom like church bells on a Sunday morning. Clear, final, undeniable. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. For months, they had tried to break me. For weeks, they had mocked me, silenced me, told me I didn't matter. And now, with a few short sentences, the law itself had spoken on my behalf. I turned my head slowly, deliberately, toward the plaintiff's table. David wouldn't look at me. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, his body stiff with shame. Melissa, on the other hand, glared at me with a venom I'd never seen before. Her mask of civility was gone. What sat in its place was raw hatred, sharp and poisonous. But I didn't feel hatred in return. Not anymore. What I felt was colder, steadier, vindication. As the judge stood to leave, Mr. Thompson gathered the papers, sliding the deed back toward me. He whispered, "You did well today, Lorraine. Very well." I slipped the envelope back into my folder, my fingers resting on it for just a moment. This house, this life, it was mine. Still mine. Always mine. Melissa suddenly shot to her feet, her voice breaking the silence. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You can't keep it forever. You'll die. And then what? It'll be ours anyway." The courtroom gasped. Even the clerk froze mid-step. I rose slowly, smoothing my blouse, my pearl necklace catching the fluorescent light. And then I turned to her, my voice calm, but sharp enough to cut glass. "You're right, Melissa. I will die someday. But when I do, this house won't go to you. It won't go to David. It'll go to someone who remembers what love and respect mean, not someone who spits on it." Melissa's face blanched. David finally looked up, his eyes wide, his mouth opening like he wanted to object, but nothing came out. I stepped closer to their table, each word deliberate, each one landing heavy. "You told me to stay quiet, because nobody cares what I think. Well, today the court cared, the law cared. And more importantly," I leaned down, my green eyes meeting David's hollow ones, "I cared. And I'm done caring about either of you." His lips trembled. Melissa looked away, seething, humiliated. I straightened, turned on my heel, and walked toward the exit. The sound of my shoes against the tile was the only sound in that room. Not one person spoke. Not one person dared to move until I was gone. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air hit my face, cool and clean. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, the weight that had pressed on my chest for so long finally lifting. For the first time in months, I felt free. Mr. Thompson joined me on the steps. "What now?" he asked gently. I smiled, though there was sadness in it. "Now? I go home. I tend to Richard's roses. I sit on that porch he built, and I remind myself that no matter what they tried, they couldn't take what's mine." As I walked down those courthouse steps, people glanced at me, some with pity, some with respect, but none of them saw the storm that had finally quieted inside me. And as for David and Melissa, they walked out minutes later, their heads low, whispers trailing after them. Their reputation was shredded, their scheme exposed. They had thought they'd humiliate me, but in the end, they humiliated themselves. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, the deed safe beside me. The roses swayed in the breeze, the same ones Richard had planted decades ago. I whispered into the air, as if he could hear me still. They told me nobody cared what I think. But today, I proved them wrong. And for the first time in a long time, I felt Richard's presence in every creak of the porch, every rustle of the leaves. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady. It was final. And it was mine.